Broken streetlights, no water in the taps, and no gasoline at gas stations. Even planes cannot take off, there's not enough fuel. Friends, this is what life in Cuba looks like right now. The island has been in a multi-year crisis for a long time, and right now it is experiencing a true energy catastrophe. The cause of the current collapse is the suspension of oil supplies from Venezuela. At the beginning of the year, the United States forcibly seized and took President Nicolas Maduro to their country. Since then, Cuba can no longer rely on its main trading partner in the region. Fuel reserves have run out, and now the country is practically without power. Electricity in homes is provided with long interruptions, sometimes for only a few hours a day. Hospitals and schools are suffering, transport is not working, and flights are being cancelled. It is simply impossible to fly out of Cuba. And most importantly, it is completely unclear how long this might continue. In this video, I will tell you what is happening in Cuba today, how the energy crisis is hitting ordinary Cubans, who they blame for what happened, and what they hope for.
You can easily spend $500, $600 just on transport.
The eternal excuse of the Cuban regime is that the United States is to blame for everything.
You must stand and wait for hours to buy at least a few liters.
There are many sick people in Cuba. The youth are leaving the country.
Cuba is facing the worst fuel crisis in its history. In the very first months of 2026, the United States oil blockade immediately hit ordinary people. It is most noticeable at gas stations. There is no gasoline, and where it does appear, huge lines immediately form.
I spend entire nights standing in line at my gas station to get 40 liters of gasoline.
Public transport in Cuba has basically ground to a halt. In Havana and other cities, city buses are not running. Intercity buses are also in trouble. Many routes have been cancelled or severely reduced. Bicycles and horse-drawn carts have become the primary means of travel, unless you're lucky enough to have a car and the fuel to run it. Even the famous vintage taxis are standing idle today. There was an attempt to digitize the gasoline lines in Cuba. Drivers were told to register through an app or by phone to receive a number and the right to refuel, but this did not help. Queues reach thousands of people, and the wait can last for weeks. Even having a number doesn't guarantee gasoline. It often runs out beforehand. As a result, people stand in both a digital queue and a physical one at the gas stations. As a result, black market emerged. Spots are resold, and fuel goes only to the well-connected. Friends, now is the perfect time to like this video. Doing so helps promote it, ensuring even more people learn about what is happening in Cuba. This is Guillermo. He told me about how Cubans move around the island. He lives in Havana and has to travel a lot for work.
Right now, with everything going on, with transport, fuel, and the rest, it's a nightmare. Personally, I don't have my own transport. No car, no van, nothing. So I hire carriers for shootings and trips. And right now, it's pure hell. Getting fuel is very difficult because prices are rising for everything.
The auto industry in Cuba has been in crisis for a long time. Even without fuel shortages, new cars cost astronomical sums by the island's standards, so most people drive old ones, often imported back in the days of the Soviet Union, like Jigulis, Nivas, and so on. They are constantly being repaired, otherwise they won't run. As a result, Cuba has become a country of mechanics, surviving thanks to garage workshops. It goes to extremes. Some people modify cars to run on coal. In March, there was even coverage of one such Fiat. Formerly, a liter of gasoline costs 156 pesos, but it's almost impossible to buy it at the regular price. In reality, gasoline in Cuba is many times more expensive. In March, its price in Havana reached 4,000 pesos. Google will tell you that's about $165, but there's a catch. The peso to dollar exchange rate varies. Officially, it is about 120 pesos to the American currency, but that's only if you are selling dollars. They won't let you buy them. A more favorable rate for selling is found with street money changes, where it's already around 400, 500 pesos per dollar. This causes such a discrepancy between the official price at gas stations and the unofficial one. But even 156 pesos per liter is very expensive. The average salary on the island is now 7,000 pesos. That's $14 at the black market rate. To survive, Cubans scramble however they can, taking on multiple side jobs, driving taxis, or working from home. But that's harder now. It's difficult to work from home when there is no power, and driving a taxi without gas is impossible. If you don't have a car, it's even tougher. Sometimes private operators on electric cargo bikes help out. They give people rides, but of course not for free. And this only works as long as there is a way to charge the bikes.
We try to transport employees in government cars. Because there is no fuel in the city, everything has stopped. With the help of official vehicles and some private drivers who support us here, we pick up employees left without transport. Because there are no other options. There is no other transport here. We are just trying to move people somehow. Thanks to these kinds of shuttles, people have at least some alternative because waiting for a bus is simply impossible. Even if their prices are inflated, thank God, it still helps us cope with the problem.
Electric trikes and similar vehicles could be a solution, but the market follows the law of supply and demand. Right now, demand is huge and prices have spiked. Plus, they are unstable. Any pothole and it rattles like mad. And if you need to travel long distances, a trike won't help either. It has a very limited range.
Friends, let me know in the comments. How would you get to work and to your loved ones if you find yourself in a similar situation without gas or public transport? Cuba is directly dependent on supplies of oil and petroleum products. Yes, the island has its own production. The main field is located in Canasi, but the output there is very modest, only 500 tons per day. This doesn't even cover half of the country's needs, making imports essential. Approximately 85% of all electricity generated on the island comes from power plants that run on petroleum products, fuel oil, and diesel. Furthermore, Cubans have long been used to electricity reaching their homes with interruptions. Consequently, many people have electric generators. The same applies to shops, hospitals, and so on. However, if there is no diesel at the gas stations, an electric generator simply won't help you. And that is exactly the situation right now. In recent years, the authorities have been trying to develop renewable energy sources. It is quite common to see solar panels in Cuba, but as you can imagine, they cannot fully meet the needs of the population.
These two buildings are the Hotel Aston. Although they are managed by GISA, they are the only facilities where the US authorities allow tourists from the United States to stay. Naturally, there is electricity there. On the Malecon waterfront sits the Melia Cohiba Hotel. As we can see, the lights are on only in the lobby. In the entire building, only a couple of rooms are occupied. This is one of the best buildings and one of the top facilities for tourism.
I was in Cuba a little over a year ago. Back then, a full-length film came out on the channel called Cuba is Darkness. As you can guess, the title wasn't chosen by accident. Already back then, the island was facing serious fuel shortages. Power outages were frequent, even in luxury hotels. And for Cubans, this has long been part of everyday life.
We have problems with electricity, with water, but it's the same across all of Cuba. It's not just here, it's the whole country. Of course, there's no light. Because of fuel shortages, the government cuts electricity for 5 hours, then turns it back on for 5 hours. That's how we've been living for some time now.
In general, since then, the situation in Cuba has only gotten worse. Because of the lack of electricity, millions of Cubans are left without internet. Communication is down as well. Sometimes it's simply impossible to get in touch with people outside the island.
The fuel shortage doesn't just hit transportation. It affects cooking too, because there's no liquefied gas. You switch to electricity, but then the power cuts begin. You buy a generator. Access to services is extremely limited. Either there's no gas or there's no fuel for deliveries, or the power goes out and there's no money for generator fuel. As a result, prices are skyrocketing.
At its peak, the electricity deficit reaches nearly 1,800 megawatts per hour, roughly half of total consumption. Hospitals are hit especially hard. In theory, they are equipped with backup diesel generators that switch on automatically during outages. They keep operating rooms, intensive care units, and wards with patients on ventilators running. The rest of the hospital may remain without power. But first, generators in Cuba are usually old, often unreliable, and don't always handle the load. And second, when there's no diesel, they don't work either. A year ago, during a previous wave of blackouts, one hospital in Havana lost power, which caused ventilators to shut down. What happened to the patients remains unknown. It is not entirely clear what is happening in hospitals now, as outages have become more widespread in recent weeks. And that's only half the problem. There isn't enough fuel even for ambulances. It's known that sometimes they simply can't reach patients because there's nothing to fill the tank with.
Not on the road are in places just like this one. Some broken, some in need of repair, others just in need of gas that's so hard to come by.
At this moment, the hospital is working under emergency protocol. The power went out a few minutes ago. Fortunately, the generator worked well.
Of course, we're tired, but we keep going. We do everything we can to take care of our patients despite the exhaustion. It's hard to rest at home too, because of the power issues and the heat.
Cuba already faces a severe shortage of medications, and often there's simply nothing to treat patients with. Pharmacies only sell bandages and adhesive strips. For anything more serious, people have to contact acquaintances abroad and ask them to bring it in. I've talked about this before as well.
They can't perform surgery on you because the hospital doesn't have the necessary medications. Before the operation, the surgeon will give you a list like this of what you have to find yourself.
And only then come in for treatment?
Yes, and we're not talking just about treatment. We're talking about surgery, and some surgeries need to be done urgently. You see, some operations can wait, others can't. This also leads to higher mortality.
Without fuel, Cuba is effectively isolated from the rest of the world. Leaving is difficult, supplies are disrupted, medicines do not arrive, and the healthcare system is working at its limit. All of this is happening against a backdrop of constant blackouts. In Cuba, the problem isn't just electricity and fuel, but water as well. Pumps and stations run on electricity or diesel generators, and they only operate intermittently, leading to disruptions in water supply to homes. Again, this isn't new for Cuba, it has happened before. The question is the scale, the overall deterioration of public utility infrastructure. Also, even when there are no outages, up to half of the water is lost due to leaks. In the summer of 2025, Cuban authorities acknowledged that around 1 million people face daily water supply disruptions, or roughly 1 in 10. How many are affected now is unknown, but clearly far more. Where plumbing systems don't work, residents rely entirely on water trucks. A typical scene in Cuba is when people line up in front of tankers to refill their water supplies. By the way, sewage systems also run into problems since wastewater pumps require electricity too. This is Junior Garcia Aguilera, a Cuban dissident and political activist, organizer of a peaceful protest in Havana in 2021 when the island faced a similar crisis. He now lives in exile and believes that local authorities bear much of the responsibility for Cuba's fuel collapse.
The infrastructure in Cuba is so worn down that even if the country had all the fuel it needs, it still wouldn't be possible to supply electricity to the entire island. In other words, two factors come together here: infrastructure that has been underinvested and poorly maintained, and the current fuel crisis.
Among those affected by the fuel embargo are foreign tourists. When the crisis began, many simply couldn't leave the island because planes couldn't refuel in Cuba. And overall, imagine what a vacation on the island looks like without electricity, water, sewage, or basic services.
2 years ago, business started going down, but since Trump cut off our fuel, tourism has dropped tremendously. Nobody wants to spend their holidays in a blackout.
It's been very difficult. Some tourists have already left the country because aviation fuel supplies aren't being replenished. Many travel agencies are evacuating their clients back home. This is causing a sharp decline in tourism. It's happening because of the current situation in the United States and its oil blockade.
There's no jet fuel at this airport, which means that planes that come from very far away from the other side of the Atlantic cannot make it on their own. They don't have enough autonomy. So to get around that, almost all the flights that are coming from places like Paris, Beijing, or Madrid are forced to refuel on their way over here, nearby, in places like the Dominican Republic or in Jamaica. That means that the price of the air ticket goes up significantly.
Cuba has been rapidly losing tourists for several years now from all over the world. In 2018, there was a record. 4.7 million visitors came to the island, bringing in nearly $3 billion in revenue. Now everything is different. The flow of tourists has been crushed by COVID, the crisis, and the fuel collapse. As a result, in 2025, fewer than 2 million people visited the island. This year, it looks like it will be even worse.
This is very difficult for us because our economy is on the rocks. We can't sell anything. There are no tourists, and we depend on them to survive.
Other countries are trying to help Cuba. For example, Russia recently began sending oil tankers. The first one arrived at the end of March. However, this required negotiations with Trump to allow the vessel to pass as an exception. But those 1,000 tons of oil are unlikely to last long.
But now maybe our transportation will flow again. Thank God.
We are grateful to Russia for its help and support of our economy. It's in very bad condition right now. Transport isn't working. Everything is getting more expensive.
I'm very happy. Now we can be sure that at least the most essential things in the country will be available again.
The island is also being supplied by other countries. Mexico and Canada have promised to deliver food and basic goods. In particular, Canadians allocated nearly $7 million through a UN agency. The funds are specifically intended for the population. China is also supporting Cuba. This includes financial aid and food supplies. They are planning to send tens of thousands of tons of rice. Assistance is also coming from international initiatives, although some of them are under Palestinian flags. For example, the convoy Nuestra America. It delivers food, medicine, and even solar panels to the island. The volumes of such shipments are small, just tens of tons. Of course, they don't make a significant difference, but it's at least something.
Right now, it is important to support Cuba. It has been turned away from for many years. But it is time for our countries to take a stand and unite in solidarity.
With all the blockade and the intensity that Trump's been choking Cuba with, I feel like it's an important moment for us to stand with the Cuban people and say that we're against what our government is doing.
Friends, write in the comments whether you know people or organizations in your countries that are collecting humanitarian aid for the people of Cuba. Countries in the Caribbean region have also promised assistance to the island. They are discussing supplies of water, medicine, and baby food. Even Americans have joined in, allocating around $6 million. With this money, food and small solar panels will be purchased for Cubans. But of course, this does not solve the main problem. The country lacks energy. And it is also worth remembering that the crisis happened primarily because of the US regime, more specifically because of Donald Trump. The Cuban authorities actively use this narrative and never miss a chance to remind everyone that Washington is responsible for the country's situation.
The Cuban regime's eternal excuse is that the United States is to blame for everything. In other words, according to the regime, the US is responsible for all the bad things happening in Cuba. But you know, in 1964, when an American journalist interviewed Che Guevara and asked him to describe the real damage the embargo was causing to the Cuban economy, Che Guevara said he did not think about it, because the embargo had both negative and positive sides. Among the positive ones, he mentioned that it awakened a spirit of self-sacrifice in the Cuban people. At the same time, it served the regime as an excuse for everything bad that was happening on the island.
The United States imposed sanctions on Cuba back in the early 60s, and they are still in force today. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, when the new government nationalized property owned by US companies, a conflict arose between the two countries. The US first imposed trade restrictions and then, in 1962, announced a full embargo. The sanctions were later expanded. In the 90s, the US passed laws prohibiting companies from third countries from trading with Cuba if they wanted to have access to the US market. As you can imagine, the choice for any normal company was quite obvious. It is better to trade with the US than with Cuba. The United States is ready to lift the embargo if certain conditions are met, at minimum democratization of Cuba and an end to military cooperation with US adversaries. But for now, the embargo remains, and Cuba continues to be a socialist state. Under Trump, the situation escalated further. In January, the United States carried out an operation in Caracas to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela had been Cuba's main fuel supplier, but now deliveries have ceased as Venezuela has supported the embargo.
They blocked the route for Venezuelan tankers and vessels from other countries delivering fuel from Venezuela to Cuba. With the issuance of the new presidential decree, the situation has become even more critical. In recent days, the US government, resorting to manipulation and threatening oil-supplying countries with trade tariffs, has effectively turned these threats into a total energy blockade of our country.
It is important to understand that while the oil embargo intensified the crisis, it didn't create it from scratch. The island of socialism has been bankrupt for a long time. The authorities cannot handle even the basic needs. Just imagine, Cuba is an island with an excellent climate, yet there are no decent vegetables or fruits on the market. State-owned stores cannot compete with private ones. For many years, Cubans have lived in bleak poverty, searching for side jobs and scrounging for medicine, spare parts, and clothes.
Cubans usually laugh when the regime constantly mentions the word blockade, simply because the people in Cuba are not stupid. For example, I remember in the final years of my life in Cuba, when my family bought chicken in dollar stores owned by the government. Most of those packages said "Made in USA." Then the average Cuban would ask, "So where is the blockade? If the food I eat comes from the US, what does the blockade consist of?"
The main question is how far Trump is willing to go in his pressure on Cuba. It seems the US will not back down from economic pressure. The main goal is to change the regime on the island. Since the beginning of the year, Trump has taken foreign policy seriously. The capture of Maduro, the war with Iran, and now the US president claims that Cuba is next in line.
Of course, I do not want war. My son lives in Havana. I do not want bombs falling on the city. I would really not want the situation to escalate into any kind of military action. But we Cubans urgently need change. If you look at the number of people dying every year in Cuba, the figures are truly alarming. In a country with a population nearly the same as the Dominican Republic, 3 times as many people die every year.
while Trump decides exactly what to do with Cuba. The humanitarian catastrophe on the island continues. No gas, no electricity, no water, and there is no end in sight. Write in the comments what you think about the situation in Cuba and how it will all end. Are the media in your countries willing to cover the problems of the island's residents? And could you live like an average resident of Havana right now, moving from one power outage to the next? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.